Welcome back to the channel, and today we have a look at the mathematical hardest rebuilds of college football 26 for the Power 5 programs. A few weeks ago, we looked at the hardest rebuilds in all of college football 26, but today we are going to be focusing on just the Power 4, the Power 5 conferences, and take a look and see who's the hardest to rebuild. We did this off a few key factors. The first criteria we looked at, we were looking at the overall of the team in comparison to the other teams within their conference. Since you're going to be playing these teams 8 to 9 times per season, they're going to be a bulk of your games, and they're going to matter the most, more so than your non-conference games. So those non-conference games can always be pretty biased and just depends on who you play and kind of how hard you schedule yourself. The second criteria was the pipelines of each university. To quantify this, we used the same methodology from last year and took the Zinke ring that we found on Reddit by the user Always Recruiting. They did a really good assessment of the amount of teams in each given pipeline and kind of assessed how many different universities have those pipelines and how strong they are. And they gave a rating to each one, and then they spread that over to each different teams and gave each team a rating. And lastly, we added all the school grades to get a score for each different school. Our rating system for this is on screen, and the weight of each of these groups is about 25% for the first two categories and 50% for the school grades. We did this because the school grades are going to influence how many people you can bring in and how often you're going to bring in. They made it a lot more difficult to bring in those top recruits. And this is because your school grades matter a ton more than they did last season. But now that you know kind of where we stand and how we got to this number, let me know in the comments what you all think. If I miss anybody, who you all think is the hardest. I know a lot of people have different difficulties with different things, and each individual dynasty will obviously be a little different depending on kind of how lucky you are with recruiting and kind of how lucky you can get within the game and stuff like that. Obviously, the difficulty rating matters a ton, and we're going to be doing this based off the fact that you're playing on Heisman with some type of limitation recruiting and not trying to cheese it and stuff like that. Obviously, any rebuild can be pretty easy if you're cheesing mechanics and cheesing the CPU. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump straight into the top 10 as we hit the honorable mention, the teams that fell just right outside of that top 10 rating. So the first two on the honorable mention list are going to be Washington State and Oregon State. And this is because currently right now, they're the only two teams in the Pac-12 conference. Technically, by the letter of the law, they would actually be the second and third highest or most difficult teams to rebuild. But again, with how easy you can schedule yourself and stuff like that, it wouldn't be too difficult. If you're choosing to add all the teams that are going to be in the Pac-12 next year, the rating would drop a ton because these would be the best two teams in the conference, making it a bunch easier for them, so their overall score would drop. So the other five that are actually in the honorable mention, you have Mississippi State that fell just right out to the top 10, Duke and Iowa State at 12 and 13, and then Kansas State and Syracuse rounding out your top 10. All these schools were within like a 1 or 2 point rating, and they were just outside that top 10 by a point. So they're really difficult, but just not our top 10 by our criteria. But moving into the top 10, we have the 10th hardest team to rebuild, and that's going to be the Wake Forest Demon Deacons. Wake Forest doesn't have that great of anything, to be honest. The one thing they do have a really good rating on is going to be their academics. They're going to be at the top of the list for that. But if you don't include that, especially this season, EA really did a number on that academic ratings because you don't really see that many recruits with it now. But even outside of that, they're in the ACC conference, which isn't one of the hardest ones, but they are still really lowly rated. They're not very highly rated at all, and they have a very, very tough time winning any of those games. Their pipeline isn't that great as well. They're in the 50s, but if you're looking at the Power 4 teams, I think they're like the top 5 worst pipelines in the game, and that's why they failed at our number 10 spot. Moving into the number 9 spot, we're going to stick with a similar color scheme, and that's going to be the Purdue Boilermakers. Coming in, their grades actually aren't that bad. They have the best conference prestige you can have as an A+, and even their academics, brand exposure, and pro potential aren't too bad either. But some of the things that hurt them the most are going to be their really poor athletic facilities, campus lifestyle and stadium environment, and also program tradition. Moving on to their pipeline, it's not too terrible. It's a little bit better than Wake Forest's, but not by much. But then if you look at their overall variance, this is one of the bigger ones we're going to see in the Power 4. They're in the Big Ten Conference. And that means there's a ton of top dogs there, and they're not even on the second tier of teams. They're probably in that third, even fourth tier if they had a fourth tier in the Big Ten. And the Purdue Boilermakers are going to have 9 hard games a season. Maybe unless you match up with some other teams on this list, you might steal a win against a power program, but it's going to be very, very unlikely. Coming in at the spot number 8, we have the Boston College Eagles. Another team that has really good academics and some decent conference prestige, but outside of that, they're pretty abysmal. Their pro potential isn't very good. They don't send many people to the pros. The only one that anybody can remember is Luke Kuechly from the Panthers. And then outside of that, they don't really have anything good either. Their brain exposure isn't great either, which is a big one that a lot of recruits have this year. Moving on to their pipelines, this is worse than Wake Forest's, and they're just not a very good team. The only saving grace they have, their conference overall variance, is because it's going to be a little bit better than Wake Forest's, but that pipeline rating is really what dropped them below Wake Forest and Purdue. Next up, we have the Maryland Terrapins at the 7th spot. And again, another team that relies heavily on academics. And if this was last year, they would have definitely had a better rating because academic rating was actually really good. But their athletic facilities and pro potential and brand exposure are still pretty abysmal for a Power 4 program. Their pipeline rating is a little better, and that is due to the fact that they have some undervalued pipelines in the Tidewater pipeline. You can actually get some top recruits from there, and they're probably one of the only teams that has a decent pipeline through that. And being in the Big Ten doesn't help them either. Their team overall variance is going to be one of the worst ones in all of college football. Bringing us to halfway through this top 10 list, we're going to have the Kansas Jayhawks. While the Jayhawks are really good on the hardwood, they're not so good on the turf. And that goes to show when you look at their team ratings. The first Big 12 team here, and it's not a very good rating at that. Stadium environment, program tradition, campus lifestyle, all pretty abysmal. Their brand exposure is a little better than some of the last teams, but their academics is pretty abysmal. Their conference prestige isn't as good as the ACC or the Big Ten, so they're going to take a hit there as well. And then you take a look at their pipeline, the worst on the list so far, rated 77th in all of college football, which all the other teams were in the bottom half of the league. The Kansas Jayhawks are the first team to be in that top half, and it just doesn't get better from there. Their overall variance is a little bit better than the past previous teams, but the first 2 categories being so bad knocks them down here into the 6th spot. Cracking into our top 5, this one pains me a little bit because it's my alma mater, the Kentucky Wildcats, falling here at number 5. Looking at their pipelines, they're actually pretty decent for most teams, with most of the ratings being around that B to B minus. Their pro potential isn't too bad. They send some good defensive side of the ball players to the league, but they really struggle on the offensive side of the ball, so it's going to be rough putting up a ton of points. Their athletic facilities and conference prestige is pretty good, but their academics, program tradition isn't very good. So you're going to lose a lot of recruits because of those two. Moving on to their pipelines, again, not one of the worst, but not one of the best. You're going to have some tough times fighting some bigger teams when you get down into the South or even in Ohio. But then you look at their conference overall variance, and it is abysmal. This is up worse than some of the smaller, worst teams in the FBS, some of those group of 5 teams. It's almost a clear 6 points off the average of the league. So they're going to have a ton of tough games, especially with the tough rivalries and the new feature where you can auto lock teams every single season. They're going to have a very tough row when you have to play teams like Florida, Georgia, Alabama, and LSU yearly. It's going to be a rough road, and that's why they fall into our top 5. Coming in at the number 4 spot, we're going to have the Rutgers Scarlet Knights. Moving back to a pretty abysmal school grades. Kentucky probably has one of the better school grades on the list, but the overall variance really kills them. Here, it's not going to be the same. Rutgers does not have a very good school grades, but they have a decent overall variance, only 2 points off the average of the league. But looking around their school grades, they're going to have a decent academics, a decent conference prestige, but the athletic facilities and branding exposure are pretty abysmal. 2 things that you're going to need to get those top recruits, and you're just not going to have it. Moving on to their pipeline, a similar situation to Maryland, where they have that Tidewater one that has a pretty decent grade for them. So that's pretty undervalued for a lot of teams. So you might be able to steal some top recruits, but definitely not a ton. Definitely no 5 stars in the Tidewater pipeline for sure. Then we move on to that conference overall variance where they're about 2.5 overall points, the average of the league. Definitely not the worst here, but definitely not the best. Finally, cracking into our top three, we're going to have the Arizona Wildcats. With a quarterback like Noah Fafita, you would assume that they have a pretty decent baseline to start off of. But soon after this first few seasons and those good guys graduate, you're going to have a miserable time of recruiting guys. If you look at any of your dynasties that you simulated through or played through, take a look at Arizona, and they're going to come up as one of the worst teams in the Big 12. And that's because their school grades just aren't good enough to compete with other teams in the conference, especially like Arizona State. They're in conference rival. And you take a look at those school grades, program tradition D+. They do have a decent overall at pro potential with sending a couple receivers here and there the last few years, but outside of that, it's not been too great. Brand exposure isn't good as well, and then the academics isn't good. They're pretty much known as a decent party school, so your academics is never going to be that good when you're known as that. Looking at their pipelines, not the greatest in the world. They just don't have any top tier talent in a bunch of those. They have some decent ratings. They just don't have a ton of guys to pull from. You're not going to consistently find a ton of 4 stars or 5 stars that want to come to your school. And when you do, you're probably going to lose out on them to Arizona State or some other big programs like Utah and BYU in the Big 12. Moving back east a little bit, we hit up Cincinnati for the Bearcats as they're the second hardest P5 team to rebuild here. Looking at their school grades, another semi situation. It's not as bad as some teams, but they don't have that great of conference prestige, and their brand exposure and athletic facilities are going to be abysmal, making sure that you don't get any top recruits. Pipeline isn't great either, especially when you have that Ohio one. You have to compete with teams like Ohio State. Even Kentucky can come up there and steal some players as well. But then you move on in conference overall variance, which isn't as bad as some teams only missing by 2 points. But having those abysmal team grades is really going to hold you down here in your rebuild. And then the number one hardest P5 team to rebuild is going to be the Houston Cougars. And that is because they are just abysmal. They start the game abysmal. They stay abysmal mostly because of their school grades. They don't have very good pro potential. Their brand exposure is all right, but their conference prestige, academics, and athletic facilities are all pretty abysmal as well for these top teams. And you're just going to have a rough go for the first few, last few, middle few seasons. Any few seasons you have, you're going to have a rough go of it. Looking at their pipeline, you would think it's pretty good having that Texas pipeline, but with bigger teams like Texas A&M, the Texas Longhorns, even some of the smaller teams that can give you a better championship contender grade, since a lot of recruits want that this year, will even steal some recruits over you. And looking at their overall variance, it's a clear 4 off the average of the league. And with the Big 12 not even being that good of a league, it just makes them a very, very miserable team to rebuild. So with that, that's our top 10 hardest P5 schools to rebuild. Let me know in the comments who I missed. Again, this is based off of our criteria we listed out at the beginning of the video. Each individual dynasty is going to be a little different. You might have some easier roads. You might win in a couple years, but it's all just kind of subjective. And it's all just a little cool, fun thing for you all to kind of build off and run your dynasty throughs. So I hope y'all enjoyed. Hit that like button down below. And as always, I'll catch you all in the next one.